first conversation is with three amazing women that are here with me. Nzinga Shaw, Candace Stencil, and Dr. Angelica Jeter. Please join me in welcoming. We've got some work to do, y'all.
That we do.
Well, we just watched y'all's favorite news channel, Fox News. In all seriousness, though, and let's do some brief introductions. Y'all's work in this space is extensive. Quickly, can you just talk to us a little bit about your background in the space, and then we'll jump in.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nzinga Shaw. I go by Zing. I am a DEI practitioner for about 20 years now. I've worked both in publicly traded and privately held organizations doing this work, including Starbucks, the Atlanta Hawks, Marsh McLennan. I also approach this work from a theoretical perspective. I teach a class called Advancing DEI in Business and Beyond at Fisk University. Pleased to be here.
Glad that you're here.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Candace Stencil, she, her, hers. I'm the Chief Equity Officer at the City of Atlanta currently, and know both of these women deeply. 2 decades of work in the DEI space. I actually say EDI. I think equity is the most important piece of this. Hopefully we'll get to the why of that in a moment. I also am a faculty member at Emory, have taught at Columbia and UCLA on this work. So again, how we measure, understand, and create strategy feels like the conversation I'm hoping we can have today. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
I always have to take a deep breath when we start these conversations, y'all. Deep breathing is essential during these moments. So I am Dr. Angelica Jeter. I am the founder and CEO of the consulting firm called Impactful Collaboration. I am a 20-plus year scientist. I focus on creating solutions and strategies that are rooted in evidence. And when Ryan reached out and said, hey, we're having this conversation, we need to identify speakers, I raised my hand and said, I want to be on the stage. So what I want is for us to walk away with tangible opportunities, resources, and solutions that we can take back to our places and spaces and bring them back and go back again. So thank you for having us, Ryan. Thank you for having us Gathering Spot. I'm excited for this conversation.
No, I appreciate y'all. No, this is what it's here for, sincerely. I believe that in order to really talk about our future, we have to talk about our history, right? And so let's frame up what's happened over the last several decades. Most of the ways that folks have understood diversity, equity, and inclusion work has been framed coming out of the civil rights movement, right, from the 60s and beyond. Can you, just for a couple minutes, and Zing, I'll start with you, just give us a little bit of the history, right, of the work, and then we're going to quickly get to where we need to go.
Absolutely. Well, let's start before civil rights. Let's go back to when we came to this nation. America was founded on systems of segregation. From the moment that we got here in the 1600s, we've always been separated, them versus us. So race, gender, religion, sexuality. There are so many ways that we have lived our lives. And so as you think about the founding of corporate America and how corporate America is set up, corporate America is a microcosm of America, so it is set up on systems of segregation. And so that's why when we go into our workplaces, we see hierarchical systems. We see that people have been able to ascend to power based on their gender, based on their race, et cetera. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we've moved to civil rights, and we have leaders that are pushing for equity and pushing for equality, but at the core of the issue is that there is a struggle between power and wealth. So this country is set up on systems where people in power who have wealth want to maintain those things. And so if the civil rights movement is aiming to make things more equal and equitable across the board, it puts people's backs against the wall that are in power, that have access to the things that make their lives easier to live than others. And so when you feel like your back is against the wall and someone is trying to dismantle that, because that's what they think DEI is, you're trying to make me share a piece of the pie. You're trying to make me give a part of my wealth to others. You're trying to take a piece of my power. Now I'm going to fight. And so we find ourselves in the year 2024 in a situation where the power struggle that we're seeing and watching manifest is really about, I want to maintain power. I want to maintain wealth. There are others that now want access to those things. And so we are going to push back in the most strategic way possible without them even knowing that's what we're doing, to dismantle what they are trying to achieve.
It's a variation of the same question, but when I was introduced to this work, and I'm sure like many folks, it was D&I work, right? And so you are the Chief Equity Officer for the City of Atlanta. Talk to us about the equity piece.
Yeah, I just want to pull up on the idea that the world in and of itself is built on tribalism, right? Who belongs, who doesn't. And I just want to acknowledge, I'm coming off of watching Origin last night by Ava DuVernay, which will open tomorrow, and you should go see it, no question. So understand that part of being a DEI practitioner is recognizing how things impact your frame and the way you understand the work. And she took me back to Cass, which talks about how in every space, in every place, somebody wants to dominate. That is literally how humans see the world, and we have to retrain our brains to not do that. We do it as Black folks, right? Think about Atlanta, the intersection of race and poverty, right? How many of you know someone who lives in a different socioeconomic status than your own, right? Many of us sitting in this space have ascended to certain spaces and places. So just remember that the whole world is framed in that way. And so if we're focused on, to Ryan's question, equity is that outcomes are not defined by race or gender or zip code or sexual orientation or ability. It means everybody gets what they need. And so this idea that there's not enough pie is a myth. And if we could get over the myth of debating the need to, can I have enough? Do you have enough? Can I get more? It would actually shift how we engage with each other as humans. Now, that is not what businesses are going to do first and foremost. We'll talk about that in a second. But systems are created by humans. And if humans change, systems can change too. And so I would ask you to think about, what are the mental models holding the issue in place, how you understand yourself in the world, and that will start to shift some of the things that we're talking about today.
The only thing that I would add on top of that is that they think that they are focused on fighting for equality. And they are framing these messages in a way where everybody wins. There's no need to provide equity for anybody because everybody's going to win if we post up and remove these barriers. But they forget that, like she said, there are systems at place that created the problems in the first place. So at the end of the day, when you potentially remove DEI programs and initiatives, funding and opportunities and so on and so forth, we aren't leading to equality for everybody. We're taking 20, 10, 15 steps backwards and putting us in the same position that we were in before. Now, will we go down fighting? That's a whole nother question. But they think they're fighting for equality, and that's just not the case.
Misinformation is a problem right now. I think that we just watched some real-time examples on national television. Talk to the community here about the truth, right? The real meaningful things that this work has produced, right? From a macro level over, we can pick whatever time period, but like, what tangible truths do people need to understand that have actually occurred that are maybe different than what's showing up on screen? So I'll start with you, Dr. Duke.
So part of what's missing is looking at the increase in access to healthcare resources. One thing that I did not say in my introduction is that I was the first chief health officer of Atlanta. I was responsible for protecting the health of everybody in this room if you live within the city. And what we saw during the pandemic is that was Black and brown people who had limited access to resources. We were getting COVID more than anybody else. We were losing our job faster than anybody else. And the reality is that during the summer of 2020, and the $360 billion that was either pledged, committed, or even initiatives and programs that was put out there, increased opportunities for multiple people, whether it was access to care, access to job, and certain resources. The other thing that's missing around DEI benefits that we know that it works. Your company cost of shares increases, profit increases by at least 20%, outcomes and benefits that people have increases substantially. More money comes into your business when you have diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know this for a fact. When you remove the diversity and the inclusion part and the equity part as a part of this work, then the cost shares, the money decreases across the board for your business. It's good for business. And I keep saying that because that's the only thing they actually listen to, and that's the only thing they actually care about. They don't care about people, they don't care about health and well-being, but they care about their bottom line, and that's undeniable.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation because DEI practitioners, I would say modern DEI practitioners, are not formally trained. A lot of us were put in place because we were a reaction to a crisis. So, for example, George Floyd is murdered in 2020. There's obviously a crisis. The world is on fire. There's a lot of noise. People are upset and angry. And so corporations thought very quickly, because the people were asking corporations, what are you going to do about this? You know, what part do you play in fixing this? And so corporations said, we're going to hire chief diversity officers. It was a very quick reaction because there was not a lot of thought behind what they can actually do to move the needle and make real changes. And so the people who were put in place, and I know many of them, were handpicked because of what they look like. You know, so if you had a black or brown face and you happened to be in a corporation, you were asked to be the chief diversity officer and not given any formal training, not given any tools and resources. And so if you think about the actual function of DEI, it's not very well defined, and there's a lot of misinformation because there are not practitioners with formal education doing this work. When you think about a brain surgeon, if I had to go to get some brain surgery, I'm gonna go to a doctor that is well-trained, well-tested, no surgery. And there are, you know, documents that they read and follow, and there are guidelines for how to do this work. When you think about DEI, I can ask every single person in this room to define it, and I can hear 150 different definitions. It hasn't been well defined. There's not a lot of rigor around the work, and so we have to reframe, what does DEI even mean? You know, that's why people are saying words like woke and using it incorrectly, because we have to start to define each word in the acronym properly. What, you know, are you anti-D? Are you anti-E? Are you anti-I? What part are you anti when you say that you're anti-DEI? And until we can start to have a common language and understanding, then a lot of our work will be misunderstood.
Yeah, I want to dig in. In the back when we were chatting, one of the conversations we were having as a group was the work product around DEI is actually really challenging. I meet practitioners all the time and I ask them, what's on paper? Where's your work product? How do you know that you are advancing a mission or a goal? My team does not start a project without coming to me with what are the outcomes we'll be able to measure when it's done. And that's because, I mean, I'm a scientist, right? I'm published around like using data as for a pro-Black agenda. So how can I not be thinking about the outcomes from the beginning? And so a lot of folks are in companies asking for kumbaya moments, asking to be treated well, asking for kindness from managers. And I'm not saying you don't deserve that, and you should choose well where you work. That is always your choice. But understanding what's possible by the sector and the place that you work related to DEI is important. My friend Stacy works at UNCF. She don't have to tell anybody she's doing racial equity work and that she's trying to solve for HBCUs. That is her job. But if you work in a private equity firm, what that private equity firm is interested in doing and what their priorities are have to align to their specific work in DEI. And every organization has to define why they are doing DEI. I did a session the other night, about 24 leaders, and I asked them, they were like, oh, we know we need to be doing DEI. I asked them why. Why for your organization is DEI uniquely valuable? If you cannot answer that question, you are going to miss the mark. It is not because we want everyone to be happy together. It's not because we want a more diverse team. That is the foundation, right? Our people in the room. But to create an inclusive environment and to ensure that outcomes, meaning promotion time is the same, meaning that pay equity works, meaning that people have the opportunity to create ideas inside of a business and wrestle with tensions and disagreement in healthy ways that lead to better outcomes. Those things are what happen when we put good strategy in place and we can measure it. And so if you're walking around, it's just kind of a conversation, you haven't gotten to the point where the work is on paper and you are clear about what you are trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Part of what's happening around DEI when we talk about strategy and measurement, consistently corporate leaders are thinking about, okay, so if we do continue to do DEI or they change the language to ESG, how do we measure that outcome? What does that actually look like? And can we measure it consistently across the board from company to company? Is our board going to accept what these measurements are, and where do we actually begin? The other problem is that they put one person who is in charge of all of this, who does not have the training to do that, they don't have the background, and they won't seek out the people who specialize in that. The other issue is that they have these chief equity officers, they have chief DEI officers, and they put these people into positions where they have no autonomy, they have no real funding, they have no real support, and most of them don't last in the role for longer than 18 months. And that becomes a problem consistently. So how can you last and create change where you are if you're only there for maybe a year and a half? And when something goes wrong, you're the one responsible. And the decision has to come from the top down.
We could spend a long time on the budget piece. How many of y'all have met a DEI officer that has no funds?
Let's have a conversation. You shouldn't take the job. Like, let's be clear that that's a sign whether that organization is committed. You wouldn't take any other role if there wasn't a budget, right? Don't let people make DEI this harder thing, right? Everything we learn to do in an organization is hard, right? Whether you're the strategy person, the CFO, this work is just as valuable. And so don't let them pigeonhole you into a corner around it. And make sure you have, like this group up here, and I see lots of friendly faces in the room who are doing this work with me. Make sure you have your tribe from the beginning so that before it gets hard, you are already paying attention. Oh, what do I need to be looking for? What are the things? So I just want to name, like, we are not here to be abused because we want to improve organizations, y'all. And if you are, then we need to talk about what we need to how we need to rethink that. Our grandparents didn't fight for us to sit in these seats so that we could be worse off in conditions, and she talks about all the time, our health. So just be careful about what you accept in the role as you consider it a service to this community we love.
I want to stick in the workplace for a second. One of my favorite quotes, I've said it here at TGS a million times, is, do you really want to win or look good losing? So in the context of the workplace, if folks here, many are part of different organizations, how do you tell the difference? When is an organization just trying to look good losing? We talked about the budget piece, but what other things should people be looking out for, right? When you're not trying to win in this space, you're just trying to keep going.
I think if you have a diversity officer who reports into HR, that's not a good place to start. It's actually a horrible place to start. You need to report to your chief executive officer because that's the person who has ultimate control and decision-making power over the organization. They have access to the budget, the money. They're going to help make the decisions, for some of the things that you're trying to roll out. If you're reporting to the CHRO, that's just a middleman. It's already telling me that the position is watered down. And Audre Lorde, 25 years ago, she said the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so if you think about what a chief diversity officer represents, it's a person who is inside of an organization, who was brought by the organization, but perhaps not brought there to actually do the things that they personally set out to do. So there are a lot of practitioners that have the right feelings in their heart about what they're there to do. But if you're operating inside of the master's house with the master's tools, believe me, they're not going to let you destroy their corporation. And they do see DEI in many ways as destroying their corporation because you're seeking equity, you're seeking change, you're looking for advancement in their workplace. And when nepotism and cronyism are things that rule their organization, they are not going to let you dismantle that.
Can we have just a personal moment for a second? Y'all have been at a number of organizations, and there are a lot of practitioners that are here tonight. How have you navigated through what you just described?
I've had highs and lows, ups and downs, rivers and valleys. I mean, there have been organizations where things were, very easy to navigate because of the person who I was reporting to. And because, they were in a chief executive officer position and believed in the work and pushed things forward. And then there were times where I reported into HR and it was a nightmare. and it was awful, and I dreaded going to work, and I questioned myself every day. I didn't have access to budget. I didn't have access to people resources. I was literally a lone soldier trying to fight and taken out in many instances. And so this is not easy work. This is not work where you go and find friends every day. This is really about deep passion towards seeing equitable outcomes for people who have historically been underrepresented or left out and deserve to be included. This is about, to me, I think about self-interest versus best interest. Those are two different things. Most people look out for their self-interest, but that doesn't mean that it is their best interest, right? And so corporations are generally looking out in the interest of the organization and making decisions that are not necessarily good for the organization. We have to figure out as practitioners, how do I help guide and lead this organization to operate in its own best interest and not self-interest? I can use my kids as an example. Here's an example of self-interest versus best interest. If I open up the pantry in my house and say, hey, go enjoy some snacks, I guarantee you the Doritos are going to be gone, the Starbursts are going to be gone, all the candy, it's going to be a nightmare. That's their self-interest. Best interest is me as the mom who knows what they need to be healthy, saying, here's your apples, here's some apple slices, here's some oranges, go get a healthy snack. Us DEI officers have to do the same thing in organizations. When we see nepotism, when we see cronyism and all of these things, we have to help the organization understand why widening the aperture of who they not only allow into the organization, but who they allow to have decision-making power, who they allow to bring innovative ideas to the table, who they allow to be decision makers. We have to explain and show them, give them a picture of why that is in their best interest.
I mean, just where does the endurance come from, though, to do that? I mean, a lot of folks are waking up tomorrow. We're just trying to get through the week, the day, the hour. I mean, this is, to the point of hard work. I mean, what advice do you have for folks that are struggling with the hour, the week?
Choosing myself consistently, constantly, every single day. As someone who has suffered and experienced burnout to the point of not being able to stand up for longer than 5 to 10 minutes, I understand what it means to be exhausted. At one point, like I said, I was protecting the health of 500,000 people, and I was choosing everybody else except for myself. And then I did work nationally as an EVP of a national nonprofit. And I did the work to really figure out what it was that I needed to be whole and happy and function and keep doing this work. I will always be a public health scientist. I will never do anything else other than this, whether I do it for myself or I work for someone else. And I will always be focused on equity and justice. But the choosing myself, coming in with boundaries, you talked about what they need to look for. Pay attention to the workforce culture, the company culture. How long have they had that position? How long have they had that department? What is their long-term commitment to the things that align with your mission? Because more than likely, they need you more than you need them. There are some key things that you have to get clear on when it comes to who you are and what you want in alignment with your career and your long-term goals. And how does this company support and feed that? Understanding your why is what can keep you going. And incorporating practices to support your everyday health. I go for walks now. I have a trainer now. And I understand I speak from a place of privilege, but also just finding ways to sustain my mental, spiritual, and emotional health. And then last but not least, knowing when to walk away. There are opportunities that we have, and there is only so much that you can do within that role. And there comes a time when you have to say, okay, I've done my due diligence, I've done my part, it's time to go, and I need to do something else.
I'm gonna just jump in on how you know an organization is really committed here. And if folks wanna talk about practices for sustaining, I was talking to a psychiatrist, she was like, you have great boundaries. I do. I'm like, again, I told you about my grandmother, what she told me. But the evolution that I'm looking for in an organization is how does the senior leader think? I should be able to talk to a senior leader They should be wrestling their own equity questions. They should have an equity learning agenda. There are things I want to know that you're doing in your own life if you're leading an organization that help me understand where you're going. And in 6 months, that should look different, and in a year, that should look different. I'm literally trying to see how is that leader moving on their own. If you are not seeing evolution in the things that they're wrestling, the questions they're asking, they're not doing their own work, and that is going to have deep implications for how you as an equity officer inside that organization can move. I'm also curious about how I want to disaggregate the money. Right, I want to look at a budget for a department. I want to understand how salaries are decided. I want to understand who has input on those. I want to understand, let's say you're a customer-facing organization, how do you spend marketing dollars, right? You have to have the data to say, oh, look, I want you to see we have not done anything for Native communities in 6 years. What does that mean? We're only spending 12% of our budget on Black customers, right? Like, you need to understand where the money, how it moves, where it's going. And if you are not reading your budget book, regardless of where you work, it comes out, here's what the budget looks like. If you're not reading the budget book, because equity, diversity, and inclusion work for me is economic empowerment work. That's the point. That is the goal, is to reorganize resources. Again, I love I feel good at work. I feel supported, psychological well-being. All those things are really important. But if Black people cannot live, y'all, if we cannot financially support ourselves and have sustainable homes and families and lives, we're going to continue to struggle in lots of other ways. And so that's what I would focus on. And then the last piece is the EDI work hidden, right? It should be public. If there's been an issue, you should be able to talk to leadership about it. They should know what a senior leader above them did or did not do. I go to a lot of organizations, and the whispers amongst staff are, this is what's happening. And then I'll go into a room and ask leaders, and they're like, we didn't hear any of that. If there's a mismatch in what they understand and know as to how their team is experiencing the organization, that leader's not doing what they need to do. They need to be hearing directly from and understanding what's happening in the org. So those are some of the things I'm looking for as data points when I'm going into an organization for assessment to see, are they really committed? And those are very visible things that you can look for.
My last question, then we're gonna, questions from the community here. Very practical things that people can do in this context, like actionable steps, right? Things that you wish that other members of the organization would have been doing when you were leading doing this work inside of an organization. What are those things? What can people tangibly do?
So I'll just say DEI is deeply customized. I think conversations like this are great, but you might get something. I'm gonna give you a nugget that I hope can be helpful, but your company's culture is unique, and therefore the DEI practitioner has to really understand the power dynamics at play, the kind of value system of an organization. People tell me oh, I value pay equity. I'm like, when's the last time you did a pay equity assessment? You don't if it's not showing up in the work. So it should be visible what the values are, and you can, at one organization, they asked everybody who worked there to pay for expenses in advance on their credit card and get reimbursed. They thought it wasn't a big deal. I said, oh, you assume that everyone has credit and wealth to carry debt for an organization. They were like, oh, that's not our value. Yes, it is. That is what you're telling me by doing this, right? So again, I can see your values. So it's a little hard to say what's something everyone can do. But one thing that I do believe has been valuable to a lot of organizations I've coached is having an equitable decision-making frame. That means that there is a process you go through every time you get ready to make a shared decision in an organization. It talks about who has input, talks about who's gonna get the decision, talks about who has the resources, talks about who's gonna do the work when it happens. How many times have you gotten a project after a decision was made and you're like, no one even consulted me, right? That shows a miss on the value of that person who's sitting in the seat who has to do the work. So an equitable decision-making framework, I have lots of recommendations on which ones, depending on the type of org, but it is a process you can go through over and over when there are complex decisions that need to be made by lots of people that can have an impact on the reduction of power being kind of overused in a decision-making process for an organization.
I think we can also be talent ambassadors. I think a lot of times what I hear is that we can't find people. We don't know people who look like you. We don't know what community to go to for talent. I think we can all be talent ambassadors. If you know people that have new and unexpected gifts and are going to find ways to dimensionalize organizations with the skill sets that they bring to the table, introduce them to your organizations, bring them around executives in your organization and help them understand why this perhaps person who shows up differently can be a value add and can help bring innovation to the table, because that's really what a lot of organizations are trying to do at their core, is be innovative. And the only way we can do that is to dig deep with this new and unexpected talent. So be a talent ambassador.
I would also say pay attention to how they're shifting things around DEI where you are. Is it rebranding? Are they doing budget cuts? Are they cutting staff? Are they shifting the strategy? Or are they just changing the language a little bit but still doing the same thing? Because sometimes where you are, you do have an employer who is committed to DEI, committed to certain levels of work, but they don't want to be sued. Because that's what we're seeing around DEI, right? So many legal cases, lawsuits, so on and so forth. They're using our own civil rights acts against us in order to push their own agenda. So paying attention to how they're shifting around DEI in your workplace helps you understand where they're going and helps you make a decision. Do I need to stay here or do I need to go somewhere else? Pay attention to their strategy. Is there a way to actually measure the impact of what it is that they say they want to do? Do they have a clear plan? Are they being open and communicating with you consistently and with transparency around what the long-term plan is? So those are key things that every single person can do where they are. Those are things you can probably find online, especially if you're working for a public company. Those things have to be required and openly shared. So,
As we get set up for questions, we're going to pass the mic around. I have one final one. Word on the street is that things are changing rapidly within organizations, that a lot of the pledges that we saw a couple years ago, folks are quietly retreating. True or false? And similar, like, what are we going to do? Before y'all came up here, I believe a big part of this is about how we kind of counterframe and put energy into the discussion. So if that's the truth, what reasonably happens next, right? Because it seems like these things are kind of silently fading to the back.
I would say it's true. The only difference is, the only caveat that I'll say is that this is not happening rapidly. This has been happening. So the day George Floyd was murdered and people in the world saw how fast we could mobilize, they started privately meeting with each other to say, how do we dismantle all of this? And so 3 years later, we're seeing the manifestation of their private meetings and the private dismantling of this, but this didn't happen overnight. This has always been in the plan. And so I think for us, as practitioners, I think the way that we counteract that is being extremely strategic, also silent in the way that we move. A lot of times we do everything on social media. We do a lot of things publicly. We have a lot of discussions in front of people that we shouldn't necessarily be talking in front of. When you look back at some of our leaders, like I saw Al Vivian in the room, his father C.T. Vivian, and Dr. King and Andrew Young, they met privately. They had discussions where they were being extremely strategic and looking at the laws. And so when they went to government, they knew how to approach the conversation from a strategic lens. We're being very reactive, and we're doing things out loud very quickly. Meanwhile, all of this stuff that we saw happen at Harvard and everything that we see happening with Bloom and others, they've been having these meetings. This has been in the plans. So we've got to buckle down, get a real plan of action, and then drive it forward. And also understand that all skin folk ain't kin folk. So just because you see a black or a brown person in your organization that is called your head of diversity does not mean that that person is operating on your best behalf.
I grew up in the church. That sounds like an amen.
I'll just say there was a conversation earlier this week amongst Black women, specifically around how we sustain in this current moment where Black women are rising to some amazing heights and being torn from them very quickly in some really overwhelming and disturbing ways. And I think the playbook is clear, right? There are certain things that are being redone over and over and over to say, I'm going to challenge your credibility. I'm going to go into your personal life. And one of the things that I think is really critical about that is that as women, particularly Black women, we need to be prepared for that moment, right? Like I have a really good friend who reminds me all the time, he's like, you're the nicest, kindest, wonderful person, but like you are ready for a fight when you need to be. And I've had to learn that from him because it's not in my nature to start there. But there are people who are literally trying to pull the thread on our lives and say we are not ready for these roles and we have to be ready to fight. And you gotta have your group to be able to do that, so have your people. And then the other thing I'll say, one of my favorite people's in the audience, I think she'll appreciate this, is the way that we got a lot of what we got, y'all, was through the legal system and through government. And while we can be disillusioned with our systems right now, and we should be in lots of ways, let us not forget that scaling solutions often sits in legal and government remedies. The public boards of Massachusetts are 50% women in the last 2 years because they legislated that if you were gonna have a public board in Massachusetts, that was what was required. So you can't say, well, I can't find these women. You literally can't operate your board if you can't go do this, right? And so in those ways, how do you use systems and structures to put things in place before people are ready to potentially behave in different ways? I think it's something we have to remember was a wonderful tool in lots of different freedom movements across our globe.
Y'all said everything I was gonna say. I love it. Only thing I would add to that, and I think you mentioned this when we were in the back, just studying what's been done and what was successful before, being very intentional and study their tactics. They have been, like you said, very bold in saying, this is how we got her out. She didn't resign, we pushed her out. So watch and pay attention. They are very bold and intentional with sharing their tactics because they want other people to engage. And you use that as a way to maneuver and strategize as well.
All right, we've got an action-packed agenda. We can take a couple questions and then tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Everton. I'm from Gwinnett County. I appreciate the conversation that we're having around basically making sure that the organizational alignment is really suited to the DEI goals. But I recognize that that's also a privilege for people to be able to leave certain organizations and to pick an organization to work for in the first place. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of strategic advice for those of us who feel like there's a heavy amount of risk for trying to push from the inside to even get the organization to get to the place of recognizing that DEI is important, and what some of those like insurgent advocacy priorities and goals might be.
I think it's always important to decide if that's your responsibility or not. Because I think that it's very easy to be in these places and spaces and feel like, oh, I could be the one to change this and this is happening. You have to decide first if it is your responsibility. Should you take that on? How will that benefit you when you do that? I think there's something that we kind of skip over. That's a step we kind of skip over in this process. When or if you decide that that is your role and that's what you want to do, one thing that I have seen be highly effective is finding an advocate who does not look like you. Having those conversations, understanding their position of power, understanding how they can give you a certain level of insight into what's going on and things conversations that you might not be privy to, and also finding someone who looks like you and understands your experience. Those advocates can help you navigate things in ways that you would never imagine. And again, that can help you go back to the original question, is this something I should or should not do? And from there, that's when you can start to make certain moves. Go back to the strategies, go back to paying attention to some of the plans, their communications, and finding ways, and if it's not you, if it's somebody else within the company who could fill the gaps. Because I think that when we see the problems, we can also see the solutions, right? And if you can't be the one to solve that particular problem, then you probably know someone who can. And that way you can just be very intentional with that approach. I think that that's really important.
I'm debating where I stand on this issue, so I always like to say any practitioner who tells you they've figured it all out is just not telling you the truth. But, you know, I had an organization that was in a state that has unique challenges around this work. And it was a national organization, but they had chapters in multiple states. And I actually worked with them to change the language on the website for just the states that had issues with the conversation on equity. It did not change the work they were doing. It did not change their strategy, but it made it digestible. And I've been calling this the Trojan horse kind of process of DEI. I don't know if it works. I can't say that yet, but I am seeing this need for organizations to do it. And I think that's one way is right. They were saying, they didn't believe that we should be talking about gender identity and expression. And so we started talking about individuality and how young people should be able to express themselves, right? I'm still saying that kid that wants to wear whatever they want to wear should be able to, but we had to put it in different language. I don't know if in 10 years that waters down what I can do. I don't know the answer. I will call out Alvin. He's been doing this much longer than I have. But that is a question, right? It's just changing the language and the focus of what people are attacking, but keeping at the core of what the work is. Can that work?
Good evening, Robert H. Johnson Jr. I am a practitioner of the work, and I've been at 3 different companies in about 3 years as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion. So this is what DEI looks like today. I want to first and foremost say the question that I have, and then I want to add a little bit of context. I've worked from technology to manufacturing. The issues are the same regardless of industry. We can't be deceived or fooled to think that it's better at Coke than it is at DoorDash, than it is at Amazon, than it is at Amtrak. Until we collectively galvanize and have more sessions like this that have action-oriented outcomes, I think the distinguished panel mentioned this earlier, we're just having conversations about the problem. My question to the panel, and I see that the panel is reflective of the work across the world where Black women are carrying the mantle to create space for everybody. It's the truth. There is a woman that just committed suicide at the college that she went to because her voice was not heard. We're not talking about that. The actions that Dr. King and Malcolm X and all of our forefathers and the people in hip hop and the people in entertainment are screaming about are the same issues. Strategy is a necessity because conversation leads to nothing but chaos if there is no frameworks. And so I love the term. So my question is, ladies, I know the burnout is real. How do we as men, regardless of whether you've had the position like myself 1 time, 3 times, 20 times, how do we support the disproportionate number of Black women driving this work forward, regardless of our position in the company?
That was so good. Thank you for that. Thank you for acknowledging the work that's being done in this space. So shout out to the Black women who create safe spaces for other Black women. And I say that because one of my closest friends created a safe space for a lot of Black women to have certain discussions and to be clear about what they wanted and just to feel heard and seen. And that's part of the reason why so many people have experienced burnout and some people have taken their lives. And so many things have happened in the midst of all of this. Within that safe space that she created for us to share our experiences, there were 2 Black men who showed up in that room, and they have consistently showed up to those conversations. And I think that's one step, is that when you see these conversations happening, and she didn't say, hey, this is just for Black women, the focus was for Dr. Claudine Gay. But the Black men who saw that this conversation was happening, they said, I'm gonna show up anyway. And I think that's part of what has been missing. And I also think that when Black men see what's happening to Black women and saying, you know, I could have been there for her, or I could have shown up, or this is a problem, if they see a problem in stepping in where they feel safe and feel comfortable, of course, but your presence is valued. And I think that Black men and men in general tend to forget that, or they may not have heard that from us. So we will say that in this room and in this space, your presence is needed and valued, desired and wanted, as long as you are showing up to create safe spaces for the Black women around you.
I want to add to that. I love that. I just want to add for Black men, when no one bets on you, bet on yourself. I want to give you a shout out, Ryan. You bet on yourself. You started the gathering spot. You know, we look at this space that we're in right now, and just the fact that we can have such a candid conversation. I started a series called Courageous Conversations when I was at the Atlanta Hawks, but they weren't quite like this. Even though I used the platform to start discussions, we couldn't get as real as we're getting tonight. We couldn't peel back the layers of the onion without judgment or without fear that our job might be on the line. So Black men like you who are going deep into entrepreneurship and not necessarily relying on corporate America to pay the bills or to make things work, we've got to take bets on ourselves. We have to believe that with all this brain power and with all this spiritual good that we bring to the world, that God will ultimately take care of us if we believe and have the faith. So that would be my counsel to you.
I appreciate that sincerely. Corporate America definitely does not pay the bills. Black folks pay the bills right here. And I make that very clear. I have one bonus question. I've got to, we're going to conclude this part of our evening together. I'm struggling with something. You know, we mentioned it a couple seconds ago, and a little context. I went to Georgetown Law for law school, and I was the president of the Black Law Students Association. And so we were there in a time of, serious unrest in DC and throughout the country. But if you know where Georgetown Law sits, it is right next to the largest shelter for folks that are experiencing homelessness. And so there was a tension that I had every day, is that we would go into these classrooms and talk about things that were really affecting us, like how tough it was to be Black at Georgetown Law. But then I would look out the window and I would see folks that were living right on at the edge. And I felt and still feel that I do have a responsibility, because it's weird to me. It feels like the folks that have the most privilege, the most access, right? And sometimes it feels like it's the most risk. Take disproportionately way less of it. And the folks every single day that really don't have the same margin for error are taking a lot of it, right? So this is part of the class critique that's a part of the work. I don't know if this is a question. I'm kind of giving a speech right now, but I do genuinely believe, coming out of environments like this, that we do have a responsibility to do something, right? We didn't go and accumulate all of these degrees and get all these relationships and meet all of these great people to then go and hoard all of that for nothing. And I know what we're up against. I know that, we've got bills on the other side of this. But how do we strike the balance, right, between these two things? Because I think in the absence of this discussion, many folks just say, hey, look, I got bills. I love what y'all are saying, but I got bills and kids. I don't have a responsibility. When I think we see other examples where that is not at least the public narrative about what's going on. So how do we, I don't know what my question is.
Yeah.
What do we do?
I'm always amazed. I used to work at United Way, that the largest proportion of givers are people who live much closer to poverty than those of us who live closer to wealth, right? They give a larger percentage of their income. It is not the same amount, but it is a larger percentage. And there's something about remembering, I'm from a rural town in Mississippi, Greenwood. What? It is the place where the largest number of lynchings happened in this country. It is the place where it took my grandmother 8 times of walking to the county seat to try to register to vote before they let her. It is the place where my father was chased out of town by the KKK, which was 7 miles from where Emmett Till was killed. And he would later become chief of police of that same town. So I don't need a lot of other knowledge outside of my own lived experience to say, there's something happening here, right? That I'm responsible for something. And then I learned about, from an academic perspective, because your lived experience informs a lot, right? It tells you your values, it tells you what you hold. So all that's in me, right? I tell people, you walk around the soil of Greenwood, there's blood in the soil. We remember the pain. It was also the first place that this phrase Black power was ever used by Stokely Carmichael, right? So the good and the bad, right? We hold all of that. And so as I walk around thinking about what I'm responsible for doing, I learned that people are oriented in 3 ways often: towards themselves, towards their tribe, or towards the world, all right? You have to know which one is you. My father has been telling me since I was a child, you are oriented toward the world. He was like, you would give your last. That's not the point. You should not give your last. Let me be clear. But you do have to ask each day you wake up, who are you thinking about? Are you only thinking about yourself, right? When you see someone running out the window, does that person tug on your heart? Do you have an empathetic perspective that says, I should be acting in ways that serve the whole, not just myself, not just my 10 friends who I love them deeply. Not everybody's gonna do that, but if enough of us do and have that orientation, that's what happens, right? I am willing, I always ask folks, like, if somebody told you tomorrow, if you gave up $20,000, but everybody else in your company would then be above the poverty line, would you do it? Would you do it? Many of us say we would, but I want you to really think about where you are in your own level of personal sacrifice for the greater whole. That's a hard walk to be. I'm not saying it's easy, but one of the things that I deeply love about my teams and most people that I work with, they're like, Candace lives her values. I can't sit up here and tell leaders, you gotta do this differently if I'm not willing to. So where is your sacrifice in your life? And we as Black people sacrifice a lot already. So there is a line to that and you need boundaries. But I promise if you're sitting on a ton of resource, you should ask yourself where you are sacrificing that, particularly at the intersection of race and poverty, because it is significant.
Where is your sacrifice? I appreciate y'all sincerely. Thank you. Well, Shaw, Dr. Judy, thanks. We appreciate you. Okay, quick transition. What's up? What do I need to do? Okay. Quick transition. Thank you, brother. I have the pleasure of interviewing. Oh, thank you. My questions are all over the place. Somebody that's an expert in this space in a serious, serious way. I know that there's some Morehouse folks in the house. Y'all normally can't act right anywhere. Where y'all at? Dr. David Thomas, please join me on stage. Is there really no Morehouse here? Okay, I'm about to, we're in Atlanta. I've never seen that before. Doing all right?
Doing good. A bit intimidated after that great panel. Not quite sure what I can add, but great to be here.
I'm glad that you're here. This is family business. You have written about, we'd be here all day with all of the things that you've written in this space and the work that you've done. And sincerely, thank you. We talked about it a little bit on the last panel, but you've talked about this pretty publicly over the last week, looking at what happened at Harvard with Dr. Claudine Gay. Let's for those that aren't aware, right now, we can give them the short version. But from your seat, what actually happened there?
So I assume everybody's aware that Claudine Gay, the first Black and second woman president of Harvard, resigned last week. And here's, my take on it is that, and I think this is one of the big dangers now around us, and that is that the legitimate concern, I think legitimate, that was expressed at Harvard about anti-Semitism was hijacked by people with an anti-DEI agenda. And what is happening increasingly, in my view, in our society is that legitimate concerns are being hijacked by people with a political agenda that is anti what they think DEI represents. And I was compelled to speak out because one of the people who was raising the anti-Semitism issue was a former student of mine. For those who don't know, I taught at the Harvard Business School for 22 years and held every job there except being dean and president that a faculty member could do at Harvard. And, you know, that morphed into, that legitimate concern morphed into a question about Claudine Gay's qualifications. And issues of plagiarism came out. Now, if you want to track it, it's very clear that there was a group of folks looking to undermine Claudine Gay from the day she got appointed, because she had only been in office 6 months, and somebody had already gone and done the research to show that there were some parts of her dissertation 25 years ago where she didn't have quotations and appropriate citations. I wrote my dissertation in 1986. I am sure that if somebody ran it through a filter, right, my method, and mind you, it wasn't her conclusions. She didn't hijack anybody's ideas. It was literally her description of literature and methods. And, you know, what's really interesting about it that makes it very clear is Christopher Russo, or is it Rufo, you know, who's been very out there, anti-DEI, basically, you know, in my view, he has what I call persecutorial anxiety, which is if you've screwed over people for so long, if they get some power, they're going to screw over you. That's the persecutor's anxiety. He said very publicly what they did, that they mobilized the narrative, they brought in financial pressure, and they created a political echo chamber, which is what that whole circus was at the congressional hearing. And they organized all of that and triangulated it very successfully to essentially create a noose for Claudine Gay. And, you know, I've met Claudine, and, you know, she didn't ask me my counsel, because I would have told her, don't resign. Don't resign. Right? Don't resign. It's pretty obvious what's happening, and we have to force institutions like Harvard to make a public choice about where they stand. Right? So.
The one word that I noticed, right, and I guess Rufo and the group, the word that they used though was power, right? He had a very intentional use of saying, we have shown our power, right, to make things happen here.
Yep.
How do we think about power, building power, organizing power, right, in maybe a similar way to oppose?
Well, you know, I think the last panel brought up this question of, you know, this issue of thinking strategically. And for a variety of reasons, the communities that are supportive of diversity, equity, and inclusion have not thought strategically about how we shape the narrative consistently. What is the power we have? And, right, to another point that was made earlier in the panel, there is power to public policy. And how we mobilize, right, to influence who occupies those positions that shape public policy is critically important. And we're not organizing in that way. And I think as close as we have come that I have seen in the last 20 years was what Stacey Abrams did that led to John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock being able to be elected here. I almost wish Stacey hadn't run for governor, because she would still be focused on organizing that strategy nationally, and she's kind of left the stage. But that's as close as we've come in this country in the last 20 years of having a movement that triangulated, that organized the narrative, that looked at what are the sources of power that we have, and then influenced the political echo chamber. And if we go back to see, I just read in the paper tonight that the Trump versus Biden vote is 45% for Trump, 37% for Biden here in Georgia now, right? That's a result of our not continuing to organize and triangulate the narrative, where our power lies, and the political echo chamber. And we've got to give that, in my view, serious thought. And I think we are in some ways a victim of being in an environment where, we can all become so individuated through social media that we don't make the whole greater than the sum of the parts, right? We're the whole, but is it greater than the sum of the parts?
Dr. Thomas, how do we think about, there are a lot of folks in our community that feel powerless. And I think would agree with you with the idea that we should organize and mobilize and can have influence. But for folks here that know someone, and I'll speak personally, I got a lot of folks in my family that feel powerless. They don't feel like they can do anything about any of the stuff that we're talking about. What do you say to them?
That's a great question. I'll speak to it at the level of my family, because I have family members. If I asked them, what are you going to do? They would say, I don't know what to do. But they look at me and say, hey, and I grew up poor, working class, and my family and my community chose me to be the one. And I think in lots of our families, right, we chose somebody to be the one. And so my voice in my family, I can go tell folks, yo, man, get off the fucking couch and go vote. Half of them gonna get up and go vote. I do that. I'm sorry, I should not have used a curse word. I'm the president of Morehouse.
This is family business. It's it's okay. It's a safe space.
And we have the press. We have press here. Please do not quote that.
We're off the record.
I already have people who've accused me of, putting the college at jeopardy because I spoke out on behalf of Claudine Gay, and that we're not going to be able to raise money. So do not say I was cursing. That'll just, I'll be here working for Ryan soon. But what I'm really saying is, each of us has power. I mean, my guess is those people who would say they don't have any power, they're not the people in this room. So then the question becomes, even in a very local way, how are we using our personal power? We are more powerful than we think. Each of us could go. My guess is everybody in this room can think of somebody in their family who's probably not going to go vote that they could get to go vote. There's a conversation at our churches, at our workplaces, that we can shape that creates an impetus for people to act if they have a clear direction. And what we've got to get clearer about is, what's that direction, right? And to guide people toward it. And, that's what I do in my family. And I'm from Kansas City. I talk to people on the phone. I call them up. I say, hey, you going to vote? Who you going to vote for? I don't like anybody. Well, you should like somebody enough to go vote for them. And here's who I'm telling you to go vote for. And, what I care most about is that you go vote, right? I mean, we are in a ground game for where this country goes. And we are not playing the ground game, right? That's what those folks who are organizing against DEI, and they are a minority of this country. They are not the majority. They are a minority, but they are winning because they are playing and organizing the ground game. Right? And they are able to take legitimate interests like anti-Semitism, then take a Claudine Gay who physically, not ideologically, represents what they are against, right? And demonize her and push her out. And I know Claudine Gay, and I think Claudine Gay would probably have done more to advance Harvard around diversity and inclusion, including anti-Semitism, than anyone else on that faculty. Right? So we've got to organize we've got to organize a ground game. And I'll also say, and this is back to Stacey Abrams, we've got to become more accepting of leadership. We need leadership. That's what we're lacking.
I want to stay there for an hour on the leadership part. I have to ask you. I'm sorry. Can tell what you mean by that? We need leadership. What do you mean when you say that?
What I mean when I say that is we need to invest in and support those people who are taking the role to represent our interests. We also need to have a set of people in that, for those people to also have a sense of accountability to us. Right, we need to be holding people accountable who say that they represent our interests. That's what I mean by leadership. And a movement that I had great hopes for fell apart, in my view, because it didn't have coherent leadership, and that was the Black Lives Matter movement. Fell apart, basically became ego-driven, right? Because people didn't want to accept leadership, in which case things usually fragment and go in the direction, as someone in the other panel said, of self-interest, not community interests, not world interests, right? That's what happens.
I have 3 quick questions, and then we'll do a couple quick questions, and then we'll get out of here. My first one, the family business here.
Say that again?
Family business. This is the tough parts of the stuff that I think we've got to talk about. There are a lot of people, and this kind of came up in our last conversation. There are a lot of folks within the community. You've studied organizational behavior for a very long time. There are a lot of people.
Very long. I'm almost 70.
You've forgotten more about this stuff than I know.
Before you were born.
I can't fight it. There are a lot of people, organizations within the community that made a lot of money in this space.
In this space.
In the diversity, equity, and inclusion
right,
space,
right.
broadly.
Right.
I'll say it. I'm concerned that many of those folks were not really about the work, because I don't see the work. What are we going to do from family business inside? This is us talking to us when we have practitioners in the space that are not practicing.
Practitioners who are not practicing.
It's like funds that are fundless.
Okay. Is it, first of all, and no offense to anybody here whose day job is working in the DEI space, I think it's a mistake to think that because someone is a DEI practitioner in a corporation, they are a soldier in the broader cause. Right? And I'll speak for myself. I, in some circles, am considered to be kind of famous. Why am I famous? Because 40 years ago, I started writing about race. Everybody told me not to do it. It was dangerous. You couldn't do anything. What happened? The world changed. People started talking about diversity. All of a sudden, they looked around. A place that did not even give me an interview, called the Harvard Business School, recruited me heavily away from Penn because CEOs were telling them, hey, the workforce is changing. We don't know what to do. Is there anybody out there writing about it? I was one of the few people in the world, right? I took that. I sent 3 kids to great schools and all that. But I used to tell people, if the only measure of my contribution is the fact that I wrote articles on race that other people were scared to write, right, then I haven't done anything, right? That doesn't make me a revolutionary. And I don't think we should hold every DEI executive to the standard that they're supposed to be the revolutionary. Indeed, I would hold to more account people in those organizations who are people of color, who are in positions of influence, who are not speaking up. Right? So, when I was a full professor at Harvard, I spoke up, right? we created a movement 30 years ago that was a river that led to Claudine Gay getting that job. But it took 30 years, but we were speaking up. And I think, right, that, you know, it's not about the DEI folks who, you know, aren't sacrificing themselves and their jobs every day that things aren't happening. It's because of the other folks in the organization who are ducking and covering. So that's who I would challenge. Because what I've also seen, and I've written about this, is where those individuals stand up, the folks in those DEI jobs have more power and authority because they have support. That's, you know, that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
I like it. It's hard for me to not talk about the importance of our historically black colleges and universities, given what we're watching. The short version, I know you talk about this often, right? But I think folks need this talking point when they leave here today. And then I have a quick follow-up. Why, especially given what we're seeing right now, are HBCUs critically important?
I think we're critically important for two reasons. One, and I've realized this even more in, you know, my time at Morehouse. If you look at most university presidents, they do not speak out about the hot issues of our time. You can go to my or the Morehouse website and see things I've written, whether it's about what happened at Harvard, whether it's about the affirmative action decision, whether it's about George Floyd, right? You can go down the line. Why am I able to do that without fear? Because I sit on a platform called Morehouse College. And so one, we're important to the community because we have a voice. The other is, you know, there's a paradox at black colleges, which is we've been amazingly successful at producing people who've gone on to be successful, not in black organizations, but in predominantly white organizations, right? Most of the alums of Morehouse College, they're not waking up every day working in a black organization. They're working in predominantly white settings, but they're being successful. And I think part of that is it's a place where, you know, and what I tell my students and prospective students, Morehouse is a place where you can answer your questions about yourself and not other people's questions about you. And, you know, my story is I wanted to go to Morehouse. They didn't give me any money. I got into Yale. Yale gave me a full ride. My father told me, I know you got this romantic thing about Morehouse, but I also know you can add. Your zero, my zero, Morehouse's zero, that's zero. Your zero, my zero, and Yale's full ride, that's a full ride. Okay, follow the money. But I spent a lot of time at Yale answering other people's questions about me and not my questions about myself. And just to give you one example, all while I was at Yale, I would never eat watermelon in the cafeteria. And I love watermelon. Why? because, I went to college in the 70s, so all the stereotypes were still out there. There were only 49 black people in my class at Yale. We were unicorns. And we were trying not to fulfill the stereotypes. So we were answering other people's questions about us and not our questions about ourselves. And I think we live in a time when if you can be in the most formative adult years of your life, between 18 and 23, in a place where you've answered your questions about yourself, you just come out more powerful. Right? You just come out more powerful. And we are seeing a surge in our applications. When I came to Morehouse, we had 2,500 applications my first year. 6 years later, this year, we're hitting 7,000. Spelman is at 14,000, right? There's a surge. So I think there's something happening out there in our community, right? Where, we've moved off the notion that somebody's ice is colder than our ice, right? And that's the power. It's the platform and it's the experience where folks can come to a place that allows them to answer their questions about themselves.
It's my last question. And it's a theory, right? And I'll be honest, I've only said this to TK before, so I'm a little nervous. Thank you. There are a lot of entrepreneurs here. One of the things that we talk a lot about at the Gathering Spot is yes, starting businesses, but more importantly, scaling them. And one of the theories that I have, right, and if you just look at the math, mid-90s, some people say 95, some say 96% of our businesses are not employer firms. We don't employ anyone.
Yeah.
The thing that's concerning for me, right, and I think that I think 2024 is about scale, right? We've got to stay focused on getting our companies to higher heights. Because if you look at the example that you just mentioned, when you have historically black colleges and universities, and you have predominantly white institutions, and our kids have a choice, it puts pressure all the way around, but particularly on the predominantly white institutions, to have to level the game. Some of these DEI conversations have to shift a little bit because they know that those kids will go to Morehouse.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, if you look in the small business context, and the stats that I've seen is that it's statistically insignificant, the number of black folks that will ever work at a black-owned business. It just won't happen, right? It's hard, right? Just given the number of folks that need jobs and then the lack of companies that can employ them that are owned within the community. This is one of those where I think my theory is decent. Is it ish?
Okay, you're.
This is the argument for scale.
You got to remember, I'm a theorist.
That's why I'm nervous.
So what's the theory?
The theory is
You
that
give
we
me the
have
data. What's the theory?
I had to bring the data because I was nervous. If I didn't have the data, I was like, this is going to fall apart. My theory is that a big way that we can change a lot of what we're seeing within the workplace is getting our companies to higher heights, scaling them, right? So that the same pressure and dynamics that we see when our kids are looking at where they want to go to school, that similar dynamics enter into the conversation when folks are looking at where they're going to work. And in the absence of that, without choice, a lot of the conversations that are happening within companies, they know that, to the point that was made earlier, there's not a big difference between this company and that company within a space because we don't have a real alternative within the community to go to. That's my theory. And I'm doing a live, whew. Did y'all catch that? Does that make sense? Okay. To ground that in a question, right?
Yeah. What's the question?
The question is, I had to pass the theory test. It was like, if the theory checks out, we can.
You passed the theory test.
Okay.
You almost threw the paper.
Y'all, I haven't done that in like 15 years. That was, okay.
And you were at Georgetown when I was there. You're doing good.
Thank you. I did not take his class when I was at Georgetown because I'm saying I'm nervous. For the entrepreneurs that are in the house, though, right? For folks that are looking at scaling, at how to create cultures that leveraging all that you know about how successful businesses scale. Can you give, I mean, again, this is research over decades, but can you give just like a couple of nuggets, right, about what winning cultures look like in scaling organizations, since I believe fundamentally 2024
Yeah.
is the year of scale for
Yeah.
Black-owned companies?
First of all, I think it starts with how you think about the idea that you're taking to the marketplace. And are you thinking about it from the vantage point of, I want to scale this? And part of scaling it is that someday, under some condition, I'm willing to extract the economic value I've created. Too often, in my view, entrepreneurs in our company have what I call a small business mindset and not an entrepreneur mindset. Entrepreneurship, in my view, is about building businesses that scale and create extractable value. Small businesses are about building businesses that I and my family can control, that allow us to pay for the lifestyle that we want to create. So we basically are satisfied living out of the cash register, right? And not thinking about how you scale. So what are some of the things that go along with scaling? You've got to be open to sharing control by bringing in partners. A lot of business folks that I've worked with in our community, there's a kind of small business mentality that you have to control it. And what we don't appreciate enough of it too is if we build a unique product and we have built a workforce that has Black people in it, even if we sell it, it will continue to benefit the Black community. And I remember when Bob Johnson sold BET to Viacom, he caught a lot of stuff, right? But, BET continued to create producers and talent that made a difference for Black people, right? Because of the way he built it. And it created more value for him and allowed him to go off and do other businesses and build and scale those. So I think there's a mentality that, there's an entrepreneur's mentality, and then there's a small business mentality. And too often we don't know the difference. And I hear people say, I'm an entrepreneur. And in my mind, I sit back, I see what they've done. It looks nice. And I think, no, you're a small business person. You're not an entrepreneur. The way you're building this, you're not an entrepreneur, right? Because you're building it in a risk-averse way. Entrepreneurs are not risk-averse, or successful entrepreneurs have not been risk-averse. They share control, they share talent. They usually reach a point where, if I was the original entrepreneur, if I'm doing really well, I probably will reach a point where I need somebody with a different skill set to come in and help move the company forward. And I got to understand what my value is, So, but to your, at least what I took, from your theory is, right, we have a lot of small business people, but actually it's not impacting things like the employment reality for folks. And those are the kind of businesses that we need to be building and investing in, and creating a unique value proposition that draws people to want to invest in us. And it's tough. I mean, you've built a business. As I understand it, you guys have expanded. And you had to create a partnership.
He's right there.
Right? You had to create a partnership.
Sure
right?
did. Pray for me.
Right? And the power of the brand, I have to say, I have to congratulate you. Power of the brand is all the people in this room. And the reason they came here is because of the power of the brand that you guys have built.
I appreciate that. It is, I say a lot, it is not a me thing, it is a we thing, and TGS, the community has made it, this whole thing is impossible. I mean, we started this thing, we were 24 years old, and I'm still with him, and I'm still with everybody. I'll start crying. Last question, the very last question. I'm sorry, look, I grew up in the church. If you knew what that means, his final point is point 2, point 3, and point 4, like, hey, those who know.
Let's really make this the last question because, I'm looking at somebody here who's falling asleep.
Wake up. How are we going to win?
Say what?
How are we going to win? We're in the middle of a culture war. How do we win? Short version, so they can go home.
How do we win? I think we first of all need to not get in the mentality that we are losing. Right? And if we grasp it that way, then we can say, okay, how do we use the power of our wins to expand our winning? Right? And become strategic about it. I think it's back to, the point I was saying, most people in this room probably work somewhere. At least half of you in this room, I would bet, have credibility where you work and a track record of performance. Are you using the fact that you have already been winning to make a difference? Right? You've already been winning. Are you using it to make a difference? And I think each of us should identify an activity, an organization that we're going to invest our extra time in that's making a difference on the ground. Right? And I know most people don't read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, so you probably didn't see my op-ed the other day. But at the end of it, I said, in this moment, what would Dr. King say? And I said he would tell us that, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And John Lewis would tell us, but it doesn't bend by itself.
DEI online, I appreciate y'all. Get home safely. We will continue this conversation. There are so many other folks within the community that we'll have here. Dr. Thomas, thank you. To our speakers, thank you. Thank you. Get home safely. Meet someone that you don't know. You didn't do it right if you came here. You didn't do that. See y'all soon.